Dante wrote, "The path to paradise begins in hell." Join Deacon Don Prendergast and David Fortin as they discuss the tools men need to build the domestic church and the spiritual weapons to defend it. This is Through the Fire.
Hey, I just got to share with you this little story. I was eating a donut, and you can't always take the police officer out of... I'm busting.
Don't go there. Don't go there.
Deacon Don.
Don't go there.
He was
Don't go
suffering
there.
because I had the donut.
Don't go there.
I went there.
That is a myth.
Is it?
It's a myth. The whole donut shop, that's a myth. Listen, I can only speak for New York City, but it's a myth. New York City cops do not drive around the city with bags of donuts. They drive around the city with Chinese food and pizza. The donut thing is a myth. Chinese food and pizza, that's what they drive around with.
And those cups of coffee, those small, tiny little cups of coffee.
I tell you, I knew this one guy when I was a cop. I'm not going to mention any names, but I knew this one guy. He actually would drive around. He would start his shift, and he would purchase a gallon of milk. And he would drive around the shift, and he would drink. And by the end of the shift, he drank that entire gallon of milk.
Okay.
People are funny, man. People are funny. I mean, I could tell you a couple of stories, but the whole donut thing, nah, that was never, at least for me, in my experience, that was never a thing. Chinese food, definitely. Definitely Chinese food and pizza. Because you got to figure, I think the whole thing with the donuts, I think that must have come about with the idea that, the donut shop is open very, very early in the morning. To catch guys on their way to work, and it's open very late at night. And so, a cop hopefully the night is quiet and there's not a whole lot going on. You want a place that you can get out of the car and stretch your legs and have a seat and relax a little bit. And I think that's where the whole donut shop thing came from.
Wow.
But
I can tell you from experience, I grew up in a small town. Okay.
Yeah.
And my grandparents lived right at the center of town, right at the intersection of two major highways in the town. And I saw a police officer turn his lights on, go through the major intersection, drive up with his lights on, and pulled into a donut shop.
You want to know why?
Why?
Because he had to go to the bathroom.
Maybe. But anyway.
I'm telling you.
All right.
I've been there.
Well, we don't want to have we don't want to have these guys suffering in the cruisers.
Hey, all right. So let's get back. Okay.
Deacon Don, you got to suffer with me.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's continue our conversation about suffering.
Yes, we'll talk about suffering. Okay, let's
real suffering.
Get back to the important stuff. Okay.
Right.
Enough war stories. Let's get back to the important stuff. So, when we understand the purpose for why Jesus suffered, right? Okay, so we understand the purpose. Why did Jesus suffer? Jesus was the lamb. Jesus is the unblemished lamb. We go back to the story of Abraham, and he's going to sacrifice his son. They're walking up the mountain. The son says, "Dad, we have everything, but we don't have the lamb. We don't have the sacrifice." And Abraham says, "God will provide." Abraham was actually prophesizing what was going to happen in the future. And of course, God was going to provide, and who God provided was his own son. And then we then go to when Jesus was being baptized, and he's entering the water, and his cousin John the Baptist, then proclaims, "Behold, the Lamb of God." So we got to make this connection. While we're also talking about this, let me also mention, there's this guy, Dave. Have you seen this guy on the internet, Steve Gruber?
I've heard the name, though.
Yeah, so I got to learn more about this guy, but this guy is a big time pro-life advocate.
Okay.
And he gives this whole lesson, and it's all related to this. He gives this whole lesson on how the pro-abortion community and the pro-abortion advocates and how they are absolutely opposed to life. Even Pope John Paul II, our blessed Saint John Paul the Great, he spoke about how we were living in a culture of death, not a culture of life.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is all related because what we're talking about is suffering. And it's important that we understand the process of suffering is not necessarily what you think it is. And if we go back to the sacrificial offering, and so the understanding of what the sacrificial offering is, when we go back into the Old Testament and we go back into Deuteronomy and Leviticus and everything that Moses talked about as far as various types of sacrificial offerings, one of the things that we see is that when you offer something for sacrifice, it's supposed to be the best. You're not going to give God your leftovers. You're not going to give God that which you were going to throw away anyway. God is supposed to get the best. He's supposed, if you're going to tithe, whether you're tithing back in the Old Testament, you're tithing of your cattle, or you're tithing of your grain, or your produce, or whatever it is, your fish, you're going to sort through everything that you have, and you're going to offer God 10% of the best. And then we go to the Passover, right? We see this even in the Passover, is that during the preparation time, you purchase the lamb, and now you're supposed to inspect the lamb. And that's during the time of preparation. You're inspecting it, you're looking it over. Do you see any blemishes? Do you see any problems with it? Because this is going to be your offering to God. Here's the problem with all this, Dave. Nobody takes this serious anymore. Nobody really. I mean, it's pathetic. I'm sorry, but I hate to use strong words, but it's true. It's pathetic. Nobody takes it serious anymore that God is owed anything. God is taken for granted. God is like the ultimate vending machine. I show up to get what I want.
Yeah, you really always will be saying that we missed the point.
No, I mean, listen, we're both frustrated with this because we see this. We see this in our lives. I mean, how many of us, even if we're really trying to be serious about this, you see this in your own family sometimes.
Yeah.
You see this with people that you work with. You see this in your own house, maybe, where it's like nobody's taking this serious. If we're, it's so easy for us to talk about God as, the vending machine, right? Somebody is sick and dying. I'm going to pray to God and I'm going to expect some miraculous healing.
That's what I was trying to express. Yeah, we are.
Yeah.
We expect
We're like,
too much.
God's not a vending machine.
Right.
We go to God with our problems. God, here's, instead of, I think it was, again, I think this was Father Larry Richards that made this comment, it's like, instead of, we go to God with, okay, God, here's your to-do list. This is what I need you to do for me. As opposed to, why don't we just shut up and listen to what God needs us to do for him?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like he needs us to do this for him because he's lacking if we don't, but he needs us to do this for him so that we get our heads screwed on straight, so that we can live our lives the way that we're supposed to be living our lives, so we can reach the full potential that he created us to reach, but we're so arrogant that we're not going to get there. All right.
Deacon, I just wanted to ask you this.
I'm rambling because
well,
this is actually something that really irks me.
I feel for you, brother, because I feel the same way. But I think the reason why we are as a society the way we are is because we have not conquered that base self that we are required to overcome, that we're called to overcome that base instinctual way of life. And I think that's where we have become as a society. And I know that our show is really based in stoicism, but it also, there's also that transcendental element to us. And where Thoreau and Emerson wrote so much about overcoming that base self by allowing the higher faculties to raise us up out of that base. That's what I think we are not doing as a society anymore.
Well, you're absolutely right. Of course, we're not doing that. I mean, if the thrust of our happiness, and we talked about this once before, if happiness is your pursuit, you're a fool, because what happens then if the happiness is gone? If that's what you're looking for, some hedonistic base level desire and fulfillment if all you're doing is wrapping yourself around the lower faculties of hunger and lust and comfort? And you're not allowing yourself to grow beyond that, if you're never allowing yourself to even remotely master those base desires, how are you supposed to get to an elevated place of the intellect where you can experience God in his beauty and in his awe?
I think you got to go to the founding documents of America, and that we are born and it is our right to achieve life, liberty, and happiness.
Well, the pursuit of happiness.
Right.
Right. You see, that's a little bit different. Okay. The pursuit of happiness means that you are in, and let's not forget, just to touch a little bit on the founding of the United States. It has been widely commented on that the Constitution was drafted for a God-fearing people.
Right.
And so you take a look at the problems that we have in society today, and not just today. These problems have been going on for quite a long time. But if you do not have God-fearing people, but these people who are hedonistic based, these people who are pleasure seeking, and they're not oriented towards the higher faculties, then what happens is you have a system of society that is in conflict with what the society was founded on and what the society is governed through. And so, just not to get off on a tangent, but you see this conflict playing out all the time. Can you, just to use the one issue of life, it wasn't that long ago that everyone agreed that the unborn should be protected. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that long ago that, even the party that is pro-choice or pro-abortion, even that party used to say that abortion should be safe and rare. That used to be their stance. It should be safe and rare. And it's now grown into, it should be fully at the discretion of the woman and the doctor, even up to the point of right before birth. But anyway, we can agree that if you're not going to understand the base faculties, if you're not going to understand the primary pursuit of life over the hedonistic pursuit of happiness and pleasure, you're not going to understand that, then suffering itself doesn't make sense. Suffering itself, it seems like it's such a waste. And sadly, now you start getting into some countries around the world, some states in the United States that have laws in support of medically assisted suicide.
Right.
St. John Paul the Great, when he was towards the end of his life, he, as we all know, he had Parkinson's. And although I don't have any intrinsic evidence of this, but I think anecdotally, and my gut is telling me this, and I think we're likely to all agree with this, we saw him in public all the way up to the end.
Right.
He did not hide his suffering from public view. And when we allow ourselves to suffer for the sake of Christ, and I'm not saying that we should be
masochists.
Masochists, yeah. I'm not saying we should be masochists and we should be joyfully looking for opportunities to be suffering and to be abused. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is when we have the attitude of Paul, where Paul, we know in Scripture, he suffered. A thorn was given to him in his side. A devil was assigned, to beat him night and day. And he cried out for deliverance from that. And Jesus basically said to him, "My grace is sufficient, for in weakness there is strength." So see, that's really the power. And so when we think about, well, what is this strength that Jesus is talking about that he was saying to Paul? See, the understanding is when you surrender your ego, when you surrender your control, when you surrender your insistence on things being your way. And what better time, what more profound of an experience would that come through than when you're suffering? I have a dear friend right now that is in stage 4 cancer, and he is suffering a lot. He's got bone cancer and he is suffering a lot. He's in constant pain.
Mm-hmm.
I watch him. He still takes visitors. See, he allows, I was just over at his house today. He allows friends to come over and be with him. He could very easily just hold up in bed and tell everybody go away.
Mm-hmm.
But just like John Paul II, he allows himself to be in public. And that does two things. Number one, it allows him to continuously experience the love of others.
Mm-hmm.
It also, and this is also part of the issue of suffering, it allows others to love him back. It allows others to witness suffering. And through the witnessing of suffering from a place of love, in witnessing that suffering from a place of love, it also impacts you and it changes you.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows you to grow. Even from a psychiatric perspective, there's this thing where people that experience PTSD, for example. So PTSD is when you yourself had whatever the trauma was, you experienced it, whether it was a traumatic single event or it was a number of events. But the clinician, the psychiatrist, or the counselor, they can experience a kind of PTSD also. They can experience one that is kind of, let's say it's one step removed, because they experience from listening to story after story after story from client to client to client to client. That counselor can start to internalize all of that trauma, and it's almost like secondhand smoking. They start to become impacted from that. So I'm saying that from the perspective of a negative, but when you look at this from the perspective of a positive, and so we know that when we suffer, it gives us the opportunity to cooperate with Christ in our own redemption, because we offer up our suffering for the sake of what he did on the cross. But likewise, when we love someone who is suffering, that also brings with it tremendous grace.
Deacon, I think what you're describing right there is the sacrament of reconciliation, because
Sure.
you're going in there into the confessional with pure suffering, but it's love that's shown through the priest by saying, "I absolve you of your sins." That is that healing element that the human spirit needs. You agree?
Well, it's mercy. Oh, sure. Well, I mean, we're all of us are supposed to be channels of mercy. All of us. And just to talk about the sacrament of confession, of reconciliation, the priest is that conduit of mercy, right? So the penitent, the person that comes in, they're dumping all their junk right onto that priest. I mean, we can't forget the fact that it's a human being that's listening to this.
Right.
It's a person, right? Yes, he's standing in persona Christi. He's standing in the person of Christ, and he's that conduit of mercy and forgiveness. But still, we're talking. At the end of the day, he's a guy.
Yeah.
And this guy, how do you not get affected when somebody, let's say, for example, somebody comes into the confessional and they're talking about how they beat their children, or they're talking about how they cheated on their spouse, or they're talking about how they stole, or they lied, or they committed self-harm and they're cutting themselves, or whatever. I mean, pick your poison. And it is poison, right?
Yeah, absolutely, man.
And the priest is listening to this over and over and over again. I mean, let's also, I think, again, one of our favorites, Venerable Fulton Sheen, talked about listening to confessions from a bunch of nuns.
Right.
And he commented, he said it was like being stoned to death with popcorn.
Right.
So, sometimes you have those days, but usually it's not like that.
Yeah, but
Usually
these
you're
diocesan
so
priests, they've got to hear it all. And
brutal. It's got to be brutal.
but I've heard and I've spoken to priests and they've said that there's a certain grace that they receive that they have almost this amnesia
Yes.
of
Well,
sin.
part of the sacrament of reconciliation for the priest goes into the confessional. There's a series of prayers that they pray, that they offer to prepare themselves.
Mm.
And then at the end of the day, at the end of the session, there's a series of prayers that they pray to, I guess you can kind of say, I mean, I'm not a priest, so I don't pray these prayers. I don't know them, but we can kind of say to aid in the release of like what you're talking about, to aid in that release. Because otherwise, I mean, it would be brutal.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely. But again, tying all of this together, when we suffer, we have to understand that first of all, suffering is the process towards redemption. Our salvation comes through the cross of Christ. And so his suffering swung all of this into motion, every bit of it. And when we suffer, we have a choice. We could either suffer and just be angry at the world, and our suffering truly then will be meaningless,
Yeah.
or we can suffer knowing that Jesus went through a whole lot worse than this. No matter how bad we might think this is, Jesus went through something a whole lot worse than this. But this is my opportunity to give back. And so I choose to combine my suffering with the cross. And you see this in people.
Yep.
You go in, I mean, I did hospital ministry for a year, a level 1 trauma hospital. I mean, we had a burn unit. There was this one patient that was, I mean, covered from head to toe in bandages. I mean, you see this. You go through the hospital, and some people you see, they suffer horribly. Others you see, and they've got smiles on their faces. You see the difference, and it moves you. It really moves you. And really you start to come to this understanding. It's like, okay, well, I have a choice. How do I want to do this? How do I want to do this? Do I want to let this make me a better person? I'm confronted by the suffering. God has given me this suffering. And now what do I do with it? Well, either I'm going to let it destroy me, or I'm going to let it purify me. I'm going to let it allow me to become sanctified. Because the other side of this conversation, Dave, that people fail to remember is we're all going to die. Every one of us. This is not our home. We're passing through. This is not our home.
Mm-hmm.
Our true citizenship is heaven.
Yep.
And so maybe, just maybe, the suffering that we're experiencing is an opportunity that Christ is giving us to purify us, to bring about our redemption, to bring about our sanctification, so that we have a more streamlined process to get into heaven and perhaps minimize our time in purgatory. Who knows? I mean, only God knows. But the choice is up to us as to how we want to deal with it.
My buddy Pat King out in Idaho taught me a really valuable lesson. Here's a guy that has had absolute tragedy in his life, but he's always got a smile on his face now. He taught me this lesson. The things that happen in our lives can either make us bitter or better. And that's the contentment that I think we were talking about earlier that Pat has. So I just wanted to
Sure.
give him a shout out.
Well, but I mean, the big thing is that, how do we get there? What do we need to do in order to recognize that, well, first of all, the life that we're living right now should be in preparation for something else.
Right.
Right? Because this is not the end of the story. It's not the end of the story. And so the life that we're living now is in preparation for something else. And us as men, if we're going to be the leaders of our families, the leaders of our communities,
Mm-hmm.
if we're going to be the protectors, so then the way that we suffer, the way that we choose to suffer, the way that we rationalize and reconcile with our own suffering
Yep.
has a much more profound impact on the people around us than perhaps we even recognize or that we realize.
Mm-hmm.
Because think about it like this also. Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus,
Mm-hmm.
but he didn't quit. His cousin John the Baptist was beheaded.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't quit. The apostles, they were all martyred except for the apostle John, who they tried to kill also, but he didn't die.
Mm-hmm.
Tried to boil him in oil, but he didn't die. But they tried to kill all of them. They didn't quit.
Amazing.
I may have told this story once before, but Pentecost, for example,
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend of mine in the police department who he asked a question. He said, what the heck happened at Pentecost that you go from having this group of guys hiding to then, after whatever this experience was, we know is the Holy Spirit descended upon them. But then they decided, okay, I'm not going to hide anymore. They kick open the doors and they start preaching. And they lost their fear. And they all ended up getting killed. They all ended up getting martyred, except for John, But otherwise, it's like, what are we afraid of?
Mm-hmm.
Dave, we talked about this, the times that we get in trouble in our lives. Maybe we should start really thinking about, are we allowing our emotions to drive our behavior as opposed to allowing faith and reason to
Mm-hmm.
drive our behavior? What actually is taking place? And then respond to that. Because it's easy to just allow the emotions to drive us along.
Mm-hmm.
So
Deacon,
I know we're running out of time.
I think we got to leave it there, Deacon. Thank you, Deacon. And don't forget to check out Deacon Don Prendergast on Facebook at Through the Fire. You want to check him out on YouTube? Just go to Through the Fire with Deacon Don Prendergast. Rumble at Deacon Don. And you can always check both of us out at www.castingthe.net. Go there and check out the Through the Fire page. And please leave a question that you'd like for us to answer. So
yes, and also, Dave, if I can jump in here.
Yep.
Whatever radio station you're hearing this show on, let the radio station know what you think. Send an email and share the program with other people.
You had a quote from Marcus Aurelius.
One last quote, yes. One last quote, and this one is from Marcus Aurelius. Guys, listen up, really. This is from Marcus Aurelius. No longer talk about the kind of man a good man ought to be, but be one.
The preceding program was a Spirit of Truth Radio Arts original program for CastingThe.net.